The Wacky Adventures of Benny the Biscuit Bandit. Chapter 1, The Cookie-Craving Cocker Spaniel. Once upon a time, in a small cozy town, lived Benny, a mischievous brown cocker spaniel. Benny had one major weakness: cookies. He loved them more than anything in the world. His favorite activity was sneaking into the kitchen to steal them when no one was looking. One day, Benny's owner, Mrs. Puffins, baked a huge batch of cookies. Benny's nose twitched, his eyes gleamed, and he knew it was time for another heist. Chapter 2, The Cookie Heist Plan. Benny assembled his crack team of sidekicks, a lazy cat named Mr. Whiskers and a hyperactive parrot called Polly McSquawk. "Okay, team," Benny barked, "we've got cookies to capture. Whiskers, you distract Mrs. Puffins by knocking over her knitting. Polly, squawk like crazy. I'll sneak in and grab the cookies." They all nodded in agreement, ready to take on this delicious mission. Chapter 3, The Great Distraction. Benny's plan was in motion. Mr. Whiskers leaped onto Mrs. Puffin's lap and knocked her knitting to the floor, yarn spilling everywhere. Polly began squawking wildly, flying in circles around the room. Mrs. Puffins, startled, tried to calm the chaos. Benny sneaked into the kitchen with ninja-like stealth, his eyes locked on the mountain of cookies. Chapter 4, The Cookie Catastrophe. Just as Benny was about to grab a cookie, disaster struck. His tail wagged a little too enthusiastically, and he knocked over the cookie jar. Crash! Cookies flew everywhere. Mrs. Puffins heard the noise and rushed into the kitchen. "Benny," she gasped. Benny stood frozen, a cookie hanging from his mouth. Mrs. Puffins burst into laughter. "You silly dog. You don't need to steal cookies. I'd happily give you one if you asked." Chapter 5, The Dog Detective Agency. After the cookie fiasco, Benny decided he needed a new hobby. So, he opened a detective agency. Benny became Benny the Biscuit Bandit, Private Eye. His first client? None other than Mr. Whiskers, who had lost his favorite napping pillow. Benny took the case seriously. He put on his detective hat and started sniffing around. Chapter 6, The Mysterious Missing Pillow. Benny sniffed high and low, under beds, behind chairs, and even in the garden. Polly McSquawk provided helpful clues. "Maybe it's in the fish tank," Polly suggested. Benny ignored her and followed his nose to the laundry room, where he found a trail of fluff leading straight to the missing pillow, stuffed inside the washing machine. Chapter 7, The Case of the Disappearing Treats. Benny's next mystery was even bigger. Mrs. Puffin's famous dog treats were disappearing from the pantry. Benny suspected foul play. Was it Mr. Whiskers? Polly? The neighborhood squirrels? Benny set up a stakeout, staying up all night to catch the culprit red-handed. What he didn't expect was to catch himself sleepwalking to the pantry and snacking on the treats in his sleep. Chapter 8, Benny's Baking Blunder. Feeling guilty for accidentally eating all the treats, Benny decided to make it up to Mrs. Puffins by baking a fresh batch himself. Unfortunately, Benny wasn't the best baker. He confused sugar with salt, flour with powdered sugar, and eggs with, well, let's just say it wasn't a great idea. The resulting cookies were so hard even Benny's strong teeth couldn't bite through them. But Mrs. Puffins appreciated the effort. Chapter 9, The Garden Gnome Grumbles. One afternoon, Benny noticed something strange happening in the garden. The garden gnomes Mrs. Puffins loved so much seemed to have changed positions. Aha! A new mystery, Benny thought. He started his investigation, suspecting squirrels again. After some stakeouts and a lot of muddy paw prints, Benny discovered it wasn't the squirrels, it was Mrs. Puffins, moving the gnomes to trick him. Chapter 10, The Big Biscuit Bash. After all of his adventures, Benny decided it was time for a party, a biscuit bash. He invited all the neighborhood pets, Spot the Dalmatian, Fluffy the cat, and even the grumpy hamster, Mr. Cheeks. Mrs. Puffins baked enough cookies for everyone, and Benny made sure not to sneak a single one before the party. But when the pets arrived, chaos ensued. Cookies were flying, cats were chasing tails, and Polly McSquawk was dancing on the table. Chapter 11, Benny's Best Day Ever. By the end of the Biscuit Bash, Benny was exhausted but happy. The party was a success, even though the house was a mess. As Benny lay down by the fire, his belly full of cookies, he realized something important. No matter how many adventures he had, or how many cookies he ate, the best part was always being home, surrounded by friends and fun. And so, Benny the Biscuit Bandit's wacky adventures continued, with plenty of cookies, mysteries, and a whole lot of love. The end.